You need to watch this video if you're thinking about upgrading your Switch to a Switch 2. Whether or not you have an original, an OLED, a Lite, or the Switch 2 is going to be the first Switch you ever buy, I'm going to give you all the reasons why the Switch 2 is the perfect console to ever exist and why you should absolutely upgrade to it. Number 1. The specs. The Nintendo Switch was released in 2017 using older hardware, and while the games looked fine at the time, in 2025, most games that aren't made by Nintendo don't look fantastic. And while Nintendo's first-party games looked solid, they're still held back by the hardware. Choppy frame rates, games locked at 30 FPS, games that can't even run 1080p, slow loading times, games with low polygonal counts, and games with low resolution textures. These are all issues that plague the original Switch. But not the Switch 2. The Switch 2 can handle 4K 60 FPS and 1080p 120 FPS while docked, or 1080p 60 FPS and 720p 120 FPS undocked. This absolutely blew my mind, as this is Nintendo we're talking about here. And when taking a look at games like Cyberpunk and Final Fantasy VII, they look like the PS4 Pro versions of the game and run pretty well. Cyberpunk runs at 1080p 40 FPS and comes on a 64GB cartridge. They couldn't even fit this game on a single disc when it came to Xbox and PlayStation. I mean, look at this. So yeah, the Switch 2 is not on par with the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. But I have two reasons why it doesn't need to be. First of all, most games that are coming to the new gen hardware are also coming to the older gen hardware, and since the Switch 2 is more powerful than, the PS4 and the Xbox One, it's going to be getting most current gen games. And number 2, it's a $450 tablet. Of course it's not going to be as powerful as a PS5, which is about the size of like a mini PC, and it's also $500. Not to mention, when you compare the Switch 2 to the Steam Deck, it outperforms it in almost every metric. And then when you compare it to the ROG Ally, it's pretty neck and neck there, but then you realize that the ROG Ally has a $650 version, which is the only reason that it's neck and neck, and that's $200 more than the Switch 2. And on top of all of that, neither the Steam Deck nor the ROG Ally can read physical games. Since I have an ROG Ally, I will definitely be making a video on the Switch 2 versus the ROG Ally once the Switch 2 releases, so get subscribed to see that. Number 2, the games. Alright, so I already talked about how the games look and run fantastic on this thing. However, that's scratching the surface of what games this thing already has. When the Switch launched, it literally had nothing. Take a look at the games Nintendo showed off during the Switch 1 presentation during the Switch 2 Direct. With the Switch 1, they showed off Breath of the Wild, Mario Odyssey, Splatoon 2, and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. These are Nintendo's heaviest hitters. With the Switch 2, we got Mario Kart World, and I'd say that's about it with the heavy hitters. Yeah, a Kirby, Donkey Kong, an exclusive From Software game, these are great, but they're not the typical Nintendo heavy hitters. But the reasoning for this is that the Switch 2 can run almost every single game that the Switch 1 can, and plus the Switch 2 is getting ports of games, again like Cyberpunk and Final Fantasy VII, Street Fighter VI, that the Switch 1 just could not run at all. Look at these comparison photos. They might look the same because of the compression, but that still helps my point. These games are running on a Nintendo tablet, which is awesome. And look at the number of games that I'll be able to play on day 1 of owning my Switch 2. I had 4 games when I got my Switch 1, and one of them was a demo. Plus, I'll be buying a plethora of new and old games when the Switch 2 releases. Mario Kart, Street Fighter, Split Fiction, Fast Fusion, The Welcome Tour, Cyberpunk. I am very excited about this thing. My wallet's not, but that's not the issue. If you can't get a high-end PC that plays games and looks good doing so, I'd say get a Switch. It has Switch Online, so you can play most of Nintendo's greatest hits, it can play most of their first-party Switch 1 games, it can play huge games like Cyberpunk at 1080p 40 FPS, and a lot of Microsoft and Sony's game selection is also coming to it, and I predict that more will come in the future, and plus, if you're into indie games, it has a ton of those too. Number 3, Switch Online. Switch Online used to suck. For 20 bucks a year, you got shitty online and like 10 NES games, whoop-de-doo. Now, for $50 a year, you get 79 NES games, 73 SNES games, 35 Game Boy games, 38 N64 games, 24 Game Boy Advanced games. GameCube is coming to the service at the launch of the Switch 2 with 3 games and more to come. You get a lot of DLC for first-party Nintendo games for free. You get to upgrade Switch 1 games to their Switch 2 versions for free. You have a few exclusive games, and oh yeah, online functionality. I forgot that's the whole purpose of this. There are more services provided, but you get my point. That's hundreds of games for just $50 a year. So let's do some math. The Switch has been paid online since 2018, and the expansion pass came out in 2021. It's now 2025, meaning if you paid 20 bucks a year until 2021 and then upped it to 50, you would have spent $310. I think that's right, but I'm worse than a second grader at math, so correct me if I'm wrong. Then let's assume all virtual console games are 5 bucks on the Switch. I know on older systems like the Wii and the 3DS, some games range between $8 and $20, but we are being super generous here. So $310 would get you 62 games, and in 2026, it would then be an extra 10 games, which equates to 72. That is still fewer games than what's on the NES library at the moment. And again, that's acting like all virtual console games from the NES to the Wii are $5, which they weren't. So in reality, you would get even less than 72 games. The point is, despite the online being not fantastic, the old games make the service 100% worth it in my eyes, especially with the controllers that you can purchase separately to really make it feel like you're playing these games on their respective systems. The downsides, money. Despite me giving Nintendo the old knob job this video, there are definitely downsides to wanting and owning a Switch 2. And really, it's just the money. Yeah, adjusted for inflation, everything matches up. The price of the system and its games match up to what we've seen in the past. However, that really only softens the blow for me. It doesn't make it any easier that I'm going to be paying between $60 and $80 for these games, especially if I want to be able to play them at launch. And yeah, I buy most first-party Nintendo games when they launch, so there's really no getting around this for me. I'm also not too thrilled about having to pay so much for storage, because yeah, it is nice that the new microSD Express cards are much faster than the old ones. However, the many old microSD cards that I have, going up to a terabyte of storage, I just can't use, so I had to spend $200 to order a brand new one, which is insane. The thing about the Switch 2 is that Nintendo is no longer the company that's affordable for everyone. You know, the original Switch was $300, you could get a Switch Lite for $200, and games ranged between $40 and $60, which is much cheaper than like the PS5 or even the PS5 Pro, which is $500 to $700. Online on those systems are between $80 and I think $120, maybe even more. Games cost between $60 and $70. And there's just no getting around that. So the cost of having a Nintendo system that can not only run Nintendo games that look fantastic, but also run modern games like Final Fantasy and Cyberpunk is gonna cost a lot more than it used to. But really, I'm not too worried about the sales of this thing, because the PS5 has sold like 75 million units and it has no games. The only games that I use mine for are Fortnite and Marvel Rivals and the occasional exclusive that it has. Nintendo can easily get the Switch 2 to 100 million units in the next few years if they play their cards right.